Yeah.
Here we go. I'm accepting that. The A and B article is now up to a 51-minute read on Medium, guys. If anyone wants to spend an hour today reading up on message passing bridges.
That's insane. I sure do want to spend an hour reading up on message passing bridges, but before I do that, I actually want to spend the next 30 minutes or so chatting about it. So I just want to welcome our guest here today, Dev from Wormhole. How are you doing today? Thanks for joining the spaces.
Hey, good to meet y'all. Can you hear me all right?
All good.
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear. So I've just invited Wormhole as well to co-host so we can get both our communities in on the goodness of today. So yeah, welcome to the next installment of our Arbitrary Messaging Bridges spaces. It's great to have you here with us. We're really looking forward to this conversation. I'm gonna give this bad boy over to you and looking forward to the conversation ahead as our community is too.
Awesome. Well, just wanted to welcome all of our listeners to the Twitter Spaces covering arbitrary messaging bridges. Today, our special guest is Dev, who's coming from Wormhole. I won't dox him unless he wants to be doxed, but we'll go with Dev until now. Just some background on arbitrary messaging bridges. Arjun, my co-host here today from LI.FI's side, and I wrote a 11,000 word opus comparing and contrasting different arbitrary messaging bridges. So some of those names are Wormhole, of course. We also have Hyperlane, Axelar, Synapse, dBridge, and probably 4 or 5 others that we covered in this big document, made a bunch of charts comparing them. And today we just wanted to have Wormhole on to give their side of the story, kind of break down how Wormhole works, what a transaction lifecycle looks going through Wormhole, and what type of security assumptions are made for any transactions going through their bridging protocol. So that's kind of what we're talking about today. I'm very excited about this. But before we get started, I just want to give Dev the floor to kind of introduce himself, his background, what he does at Wormhole, etc.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Dev, also known as Chase. I'm a core contributor to Wormhole. I've worked on quite a few of the sort of major things which have happened. I joined a little before the launch of Wormhole version 2 in the middle of last year. And, since then I've done some major work on Wormchain. I've also done a ton of work relating to relayers and just kind of like core components of the ecosystem, core trust assumptions, and kind of like looking forward, what some of like the just first principles kind of solutions probably look like for the space of interoperability and decentralized computing as a whole.
There we go. We're really excited to have you. Just to give even a little bit more background to the listeners, if we say arbitrary messaging bridge, we're going to call that an A and B for the rest of the show. And just to explain that, like I'm explaining to a fifth grader just at the beginning here, a lot of bridges that you think about in the crypto world, your first thought, many people's first thought is that a bridge allows a token to be moved from chain A to chain B. An arbitrary messaging bridge kind of changes that format from moving a token from chain A to chain B to moving a piece of data or a message from chain A to chain B. So arbitrary messaging bridges really kind of open up the dev space, because instead of just moving liquidity, you can move, governance transactions. You can move NFTs. You can do a cross-chain contract call. You can do a bunch of really, really fun stuff. And so today we're talking with Wormhole about their messaging layer. They're kind of best known for, the portal bridge, and they also have an NFT version of their token bridge. That's not the main focus here. We're definitely going to touch on it, but we're really here to talk about messaging. And with that, Chase, I think I'm going to open the floor to you. I would explain what Wormhole is, but I only docs and research your docs. You probably helped write the docs. So I'll give you the floor to kind of give the TLDR on Wormhole.
Yeah, certainly. So just kind of like a basic history of Wormhole is that it first launched as a simple token bridge in 2020. It was done on it was initially kind of spurred as a grant project from the Solana Foundation. It was built by the Certus One team, and that was the Wormhole version 1 token bridge. Went between Solana and Wormhole, Solana and Ethereum. And basically, it was kind of the insight of the Certus One guys that in building this token bridge, which spans two very different virtual machine environments between Solana, which is Rust based BPF, and then good old Ethereum EVM, that they'd kind of had to solve quite a few problems that are just kind of inherent to this interoperability and sort of like heterogeneous ecosystem space of settling between trusted, untrusted, various kind of layer ones, almost as if they're untrusted counterparties and things like that. So the insight was kind of that, well, if Certus One, which was one of the world's leading validator companies, kind of joined up with a bunch of the other top validator companies in the world, then you could potentially build an interoperability platform that could expand beyond just like EVM and kind of the most popular high TVL chains at the time, but to a lot of these kind of new burgeoning blockchains that were coming on the scene at the time, like Algorand, Near, Cosmos also is a incredibly important platform in the space. So sort of from day one, the idea was to unify some of the top validators in the space who underpin a huge portion of proof of stake as is, and sort of grow their reach by creating a robust interoperability platform to begin creating these like distributed, decentralized applications which could leverage the strengths of individual blockchains and also solve a lot of the user frictions and things like that associated with traditional bridging.
Awesome. And just, high level, I think when Arjun and I initially wrote our article, Wormhole connected 14 chains. I think you guys have expanded since then. What can you give us a number here on the latest update?
I don't know. I feel like there's a new one every week at this point. I think it's over 20 at this point, and it's also across 6 different virtual machines, which is really unprecedented in the space. So there are like 12 EVM chains or something, but there's also Solana, Algorand, Near, Cosmwasm, Aptos. Wormhole is available for launch day 1 on Aptos, and the SWI contracts are also nearing completion. So seven different virtual machine environments, and then I believe the number is like 21 or 22, something like that, in total.
Yeah, that's 7 different VM environments is super impressive. That's actually pretty wild. I didn't know it was that many. Okay, so I think this is a good time to if we're throwing around VM, it's time to get into the nitty gritty details, right? So let's kind of dive into Wormhole a little bit. We're gonna kind of start at a high level and talk about like the major players in the Wormhole ecosystem, which would be core bridge contracts, guardians, relayers, and verified action approval VAAs. Could you just maybe describe what each of those players are and what they do for Wormhole? Because I think those are the 4 main players that people need to understand in the context of passing a message between one of the Wormhole supported chains.
Yeah, that's a excellent prompt, and those are probably the most important ones to talk about. So the kind of arbitrary messaging bridge platform that we talk about today is kind of like becoming the most prevalent design for interoperability, and it's based off 2 core primitives, kind any way you dice it is that there's some form of notarization happening, and then also some form of relay happening. So the notary, which in the case of Wormhole is the Guardian network, it's kind of a branded term, but the Guardian network, a network of 19 of the world's top validator companies that sort of underpin the trust assumptions of the Wormhole network. And so the sort of key thing here is that the notary in this is responsible for producing state attestations for the arbitrary messaging protocol. And then relayers are simply dumb delivery trucks. They effectively take these attestations that say this contract on this chain produced this state at this time, and then they take this and they deliver it anywhere it's supposed to go. And this can be done in either a generic fashion that's kind of in a incentivized mechanism that makes it worthwhile for the relayer to do it, or you can do it in an application specific manner, and we can kind of get into like some cool things that are being done with like Pith or other people that have really novel relaying mechanisms. But fundamentally, these are kind of the two components of arbitrary message bridging. You produce a state attestation, and then you get it where it needs to go and produce a state update based on that. So in this scenario, you have the guardians, the relayers, and then the verified action approval is simply the term for a state attestation. We tend to just say, like in common parlance, attestation, like VAA is kind of just one of those like word salad letter things that goes in one ear and out the other. Attestations, they attest that state certainly happened on one blockchain. That's kind of the core component. A few sort of key things that people tend to miss in this, which are worth highlighting, which is that the guardians have kind of additional things that they do beside just kind of like reading state off a light client and shipping a thing. All of the guardians run full nodes for every chain in the network, which is actually like an enormous ask, just kind of from an infrastructure perspective, and that's why there's a large benefit to having some very serious validator companies doing this, because they're adept enough to kind of handle this workload. And additionally, relayers in the Wormhole space are always untrusted. So the sort of key point of this is that the state attestation is signed, and so those signatures can't be, like, the state attestation cannot be modified without invalidating the signatures. So relayers can be trusted to simply kind of deliver these without in any way being able to modify them, and that really dramatically increases the flexibility of delivery in the system, whereby you can kind of get it there by hook or by crook and by any incentive structure that you want, without necessarily being limited to like, okay, well, the relayer has to agree with the notary or something at the end of the day. So that's one of the sort of key assumptions that allows the system to be so flexible. It's also specifically designed to be forward extensible into zero knowledge proofs, because this is very similar to when you produce a zero knowledge roll up of a state on a chain or something. It's a very similar trust model. So in the future, these attestations can be swapped out for different signing schemes and can also be swapped out for a zero knowledge proof system.
Oh, I did not know that. That is very cool, because we've seen so many different iterations of optimistically verified bridges in 2022. That's kind of, in my opinion, it's ridden the wave of the optimistic rollups. And I've been kind of waiting for Wormhole to get in on the optimistic trend. But are you saying that you guys are just kind of waiting for ZKs to get into a different type of verification model there?
Yeah,
That's spicy.
ZKs are a core focus of Wormhole. There's actually an entire team at Jump that's just like doing ZK research and actually like doing work with FPGAs and working on like hardware acceleration for zero knowledge proofs to make proving systems for these sort of things. It's also like kind of famously a core component of the Algorand ecosystem. Algorand's really interesting because they actually already produce these state attestations or these ZK proofs of their blockchain state every 15 minutes or so. So we're kind of investigating that space of just like, in the larger community discussing like, okay, well, like what's actually going to be feasible, say in a couple years from now, and like what problems will zero knowledge proofs solve and what problems won't they solve. But kind of evidently from day one, just from a basic understanding of like kind of the math, is like they produce proofs of, and so if you have some core fundamental that is an attestation of state, that's kind of one for one replaceable, once the technology becomes robust enough to support it.
Oh man, Arjun and I have been waiting for the big ZK bridge research piece to drop. So I hope that Wormhole and perhaps Jump kind of publish that soon. I can't wait. That's going to be so fun. Okay, so that was a lot of big time information. I think something that we always get questions about on Wormhole is kind of the Guardian network. I'm sure that's kind of the same thing for you guys. I believe you have 19 Guardians at the moment. Can you kind of talk about, you mentioned that it's a huge workload to be a Guardian on Wormhole. I would love if you could dive into that just a little bit more, and kind of talk about why 19, if you're trying to expand that number, and exactly what these Guardians do.
Yeah, so if we kind of like roll back to Wormhole V1, and like what you need to do when going to Wormhole V2, like just kind of like thinking about it, when you deprecate the Wormhole V1 bridge and kind of make a Wormhole V2 platform that's not even really a token bridge anymore, it's at the level of the interoperability thing, you're instantly going to have to launch this thing that's going to like have billions in TVL potentially, right? Because like you're going to deprecate the old bridge, which already had like $1 gajillion, or who knows? I don't know what the number was, but it was a lot, and expand to a lot of other ecosystems. So it needed to be extremely robust from day one. But furthermore, if you're setting out with this goal of like, hey, the whole point here is that we're going to be on Cosmos and Solana and EVM from day one, then you start to kind of like look at the trust assumptions underpinning this and find that like one of the sort of scariest things is that you're like working on these VMs that are like relatively new, necessarily hyper stable. Additionally, potentially on some blockchains that are have very small validator sets or something like that. And so, sort of the key idea is that like, well, we can just, if we pin the trust assumptions on like, here's like 20-ish of the world's top validator companies, and the buck stops there. They all run full node. If there's a consensus hijack, if there's some sort of thing like that, they can at least detect those. So if we trust the guardians, to be honest, we don't even have to necessarily trust the consensus of the blockchain to be, because if there's a fraudulent proof, they have the full transaction history, they're validating every single transaction, they will catch a fraudulent proof. Similarly, if there's a undetected hard fork, which happens much more frequently than you would expect, the Guardian network will disconnect rather than allow some like, just act of God state update to happen. And so like these two attack vectors, which are very, very, very serious threats in the bridging space, are effectively just covered by the infrastructure which Guardians run. And so just sort of being able to like show up to any blockchain and just drop the Guardians and be like, okay, well, like, just run your stuff. And if you run your stuff and you don't produce some malicious things, then, we'll at least know that like there was not a consensus hijack. And then there's, that's not entire attack surface of sort of like what can happen in the security of the bridging space, but those are two incredibly huge attack vectors that get closed with a relatively simple and elegant solution of simply like, bring around the validator companies, publish the names publicly, and rely on them and have the buck stop there, rather than kind of opening up a huge contagion to relatively low value chains potentially.
Okay, yeah, the hard fork situation is completely under discussed. That's just such a major issue that can happen with especially messaging bridges and liquidity networks. I wish we had like 2 hours to dive into that, but we don't. Okay, and then the next question I wanted to ask about the Guardian network is that we always, like in the bridging world specifically, like slashing is such a major thing for entities that act maliciously. But Arjuna and I have been able to glean from your white paper and stuff like that. Wormhole has decided to not do slashing at the Guardian level. Can you kind of talk about that decision and why reputation of these Guardians is so much more important that like slashing might not even be necessary?
Correct. I would not necessarily. I'd say kind of like what is the fundamental primitive of slashing, right? Like, except for like to punish someone who behaves badly. And so there's not slashing at the Guardian level, like as you said. But similarly, like these are all huge validator companies. We're talking like companies like Figment, Everstake, Chorus One, Jump Crypto, right? Like these are publicly listed on Wormhole.com. And if you just like start going and looking at their validators on each of these, they have billions and billions. I don't know what the total TVL, like the total value staked of like all the Guardians in the Guardian network is, but it's an enormous number. So these entities are already hugely invested in the space. They have huge amounts staked that can be slashed on those chains, on the chains themselves, and then they have a huge vested interest in sort of the entire space growing. And so there's not sort of this first order level of slashing that happens at the Guardian level that's like baked into the protocol, but there's a huge level of accountability. And these entities are, by and large, very heavily invested in the space.
Yeah, man. So I just, how big is your research team at Wormhole? Because I find it fascinating. You guys are kind of going against the status quo of the bridging space with both not deciding not to slash at the Guardian level, and then also going for ZKs in 2022 when optimistic verification is the hottest thing is kind of a interesting direction to take. Are you guys just kind of trying to live in your own silo and build out your own bridging solution without looking at the industry at large? Like, how do you guys take steps to, or even like to decide what chain to go to next? How are those decisions made internally?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at the Guardian network, and like this is all open source code. Another thing about Wormhole is 100% of the development is done out in the open. Like it's all under the Wormhole Foundation GitHub repository. The way it works is that like the Guardians, there are 19 Guardians, and the 19 Guardians have, have signing authority to produce updates. And so effectively, like it all comes down to governance votes on the Guardians. If you can convince the Guardians it's a good idea, then it happens, and if you can't, it doesn't. So the now that being said, there are various validators, various companies. Jump is very largely involved in the space, but Triton One also like is a fantastic kind of little bit of a thought leader in the validating space. There's also additional contributing parties who do smart contract development. There's now people at the Wormhole Foundation working on this full time. So I'm not sure I could necessarily give you a number. I don't know necessarily how many people like work at Everstake or something. But we're out there in the hundreds. Jump in particular has Jump Crypto is I think closing in on close to 200 people or something like that. So I don't necessarily know how large the space is, but we certainly try to approach it like the ethos of Wormhole like kind of has always been to like approach it from first principles and to be pragmatic. And so I understand that like optimistic sounds nice because it really like minimizes the trust of like that thing that happens in bridging, like that little bit there that is the trust of like, yes, but the person who has the signing authority could technically rug you or something. But that's like that's like one attack vector. There's also hard forks. There's also VM exploits. There's also smart contract risk. There's also, consensus, tokenomics exploits, mechanism exploits. And so like all of these, and I think what we've seen from the space is that like with the exception of a couple of bridges where it's like turned out that like there's only like one private key or something, the exploits have come elsewhere. They've been smart contract risk. They have been, some like VM voodoo exploit or something. So yeah, I just think that like the prevailing discussion is not necessarily indicative of the real threats in that regard.
So I think this is a perfect time to kind of go into the trust assumptions portion of our conversation here. And literally written down first on my sheet is what does Wormhole think about smart contract risk, and what are you guys doing to mitigate that risk? I'm fascinated.
Yeah, the name of the game is now redundant checks. Like at a certain point, like you can verify your smart contracts all you want, and then someone will just come around with a VM exploit anyway, or hard fork or something like that. So even if you have the world's most perfect, you still need redundant checks. So one of the sort of most cutting edge features that's rolling out as part of Wormchain is accounting. So like one of the things now that happens is that all effectively the circulating supply of every token is just tracked. And so as a result, the guardians can, as part of processing transactions, like see if there's a logically impossible transfer. It's like, well, you're sending more money than your chain is even supposed to. You're like sending more of these tokens than your chain is even supposed to have in the first place. And so that clearly is just some sort of exploit. And so like that at that level, we can have two smart contracts running on two different blockchains that are both sort of trying to verify the same universal state. And so in that scenario, you can kind of like catch these exploits and have multiple layers of defense. So you can implement these at the level of the smart contract, but you can also sort of like the emitter, you can implement these sort of redundant checks on the receiver. You can implement sort of like third-party off-chain stuff that still just runs on some other blockchain that has access to the universal state, which is kind of one of the key ideas underpinning Wormchain. So really the name of the game is like, yes, do your audits. There's like I don't know how much money was spent on audits, but it was absolutely silly. Like you can go check out wormhole.com. The audit page is just sort of like it just feels like a flex to me. But the real thing that you need to do is have things which prevent contagion, redundant checks, and then stop losses, so that there's sort of gates of like, okay, well, if that blockchain was compromised, it could transfer out the entire value of that token, but that's only 2% of the circulating supply. And that's potentially um, potentially a better scenario to be in than just having unlimited contagion. So a lot of these problems that are just kind of result when you when your bridging protocol doesn't trust the blockchains themselves. That's kind of a very different problem space to be solving for, that you can't necessarily solve with like smart contract risk, because they will simply circumvent your smart contracts. So that's kind of my thoughts. The name of the game is really how to manage untrusted counterparties, and that's a historically very hard problem.
That is maybe the problem in the entire crypto industry. And then I do want to just shout out, I think you guys have a $10 million offer on Immunify from a bounty perspective, which is, I think, still the biggest in the space, if that's still the right number.
Yep. To my knowledge, that's still out there. I think people have claimed money out of that out of the bug bounty program. It's out there, and yeah, that's an additional line of defense, right? Like, if you find an exploit and it's small, you might as well just claim the bug bounty instead. That's certainly just one of those pragmatic sort of solutions to these problems as well.
Awesome. And then another question about trust assumptions I wanted to throw out there is censorship resistance. So I think on Wormhole right now. It takes 1/3 of guardians to censor a message, which now censorship of messages, in my opinion, when you're moving liquidity, isn't that big of a deal, because it's I don't know. It's just it's more like you can't hurt a cross chain DApp, in my opinion, if you like make a transaction wait a little bit longer. But like when it comes to like sending messages at a really high volume across chains, if you can censor these transactions easily, then like it gets really hard to build infrastructure out. Um, what do you think about the censorship um, number at Wormhole being at 1/3, and what does censorship actually mean on Wormhole? Because that sometimes that word gets thrown around a lot, but it's sometimes not very defined well.
Yeah, the censorship is kind of like, people throw around like the Nakamoto coefficient or something like that, but the most common thing that is that you get a 100% guardian shut off. There have been several times in like the history of Wormhole where like a hard chain has just hard forked out of nowhere. And in that scenario, what happens is all of the guardians disconnect because like the blockchain effectively ceases to exist, and you get censorship. But and like you might look at that and be like, okay, well that's censorship. But we're just like, yeah, well the guardians consider it to be a new blockchain actually. And so then there's kind of so that generally is a like governance level thing of like, hey, this is technically a new blockchain over here with different rules and potentially had some unpermissioned state updates from our perspective. Should we support this new blockchain? So like that's like we don't necessarily think of that as censorship in the technical term, but it's like an incredibly important security property to have. That just like hard forks don't just like go unnoticed. Um, so similarly, like if someone does manage to take off like 7 of the guardians and you know go and plug all their computers or something, then like you would have an outage. So it ultimately does come down to the guardians, but you tend to in most cases it's a very clear distinction of like, okay, well this is potentially a insecure scenario, or just like this is business as usual.
Perfect. Okay, so I think this is the time in the A and B show where I get to ask you some like more fun questions instead of grilling you about like the definition of guardians and censorship and all that stuff. And so we kind of call this section in the A and B article "Why Wormhole." And so my first cue to you is, where do you see Wormhole sit in the arbitrary messaging bridge world? Do you view the bridging industry as a one bridge to rule them all type of environment, or are you looking to work with other A and B solutions like Axelar, Layer Zero, etc. In the long term?
I think in the long term of just like if you look out, I don't know, 10 years or something, like the space looks so different, and we're so early in the game that we're very concerned at the moment about like, hey, who's got control of these mints on these blockchains or anything like that. But the sort of core fundamental thing that Wormhole has like from day one tried to enable, as I see it, is really this like forward looking distributed design towards decentralized computing. There will be application specific blockchains, and there will be multiple layer ones, and there will be multiple layer ones because they will specialize, right? You will have blockchains which specialize in being hugely distributed and having a gajillion validators. There will be ones which like barely even have smart contracts but have huge amounts of data storage, with the rise of like zero knowledge proofs and a huge demand for sort of like these parallel computing, like multi-scalar multiplication sort of things. Probably going to come out with a GPU based layer one of these days. There's also a lot of new primitives that we don't really discuss. like, oracles. Like oracles are a huge part of this decentralized computing space. We don't really consider them to be layer ones, but like a huge service that's kind of offered by Wormhole is that like Pith dumps its entire data feed into Wormhole. It's literally like right now humming out like 23 transactions per second, just dumping them into Wormhole and making them available to like every chain in the Wormhole ecosystem. So, like all of these primitives are going to be incredibly important. And there's going to be specialized layer ones. There's going to be, as of yet, uninvented computing platforms and primitives. And so Wormhole's core focus with,
Great. Okay, so I just kind of gave everyone the TLDR. We already talked about Wormhole, kind of how Wormhole worked at the lower levels, and now we're kind of talking about Wormhole. What's being built on top, where you guys fit in the bridging industry, etc. And so I think we can just kind of hop right back into that conversation if you're cool with that. I won't make you re-answer the question of is this a one bridge to rule them all environment, mostly because that's my Lord of the Rings reference and I'm only allowed to do one Lord of the Rings reference a day. But I would like to ask you, like, what types of dApps or applications or cool products are being built on top of Wormhole's messaging layer that couldn't be built on top of Portal or the liquidity networks?
Yeah. So I think there's quite a few realms of things that are sort of happening and happening both like above and below the Wormhole layer and sort of in quite a few areas. So probably the first one is just I think the foremost concern is that Wormhole is interested in connecting interesting interesting blockchains, right? It's like just as evidenced by the support for so many VMs. Because I think like the sort of most key thing is that like we often sort of think about like what style of applications does networking involve, but I'm just as interested in what sort of layer ones does networking allow to be created. So I think that that's uh, hugely important and very much in a part that's not talked about the space. Like if you have networking, there are just things that you can set out to build in the first place that you symbiosis of the ecosystem to support. And so that just opens up like a whole new world of possibilities. And so I think like the biggest gains are still yet to come, and they will come from extremely novel utilizations, probably below the stack in terms of Wormhole rather than above it in many ways. One of the coolest integrations, in my opinion, is certainly Pith. They have like this insane relayer network that's trying to get like price data to every blockchain in the world in like under 1 second or something like that. Some ridiculous number. They pump the entire Pith data feed just straight into Wormhole. And just like the way that the Guardian network works, and simply gossip signatures, and all of the Guardians all have the data locally, effectively allows the Guardian network to come to consensus um, as fast as you can ship packets around the internet. And so like that's kind of a core component of like why Wormhole Pith is able to distribute their data the way that they do. So these are sort of like and then another thing that a lot of people are building is that the Wormhole asset layer, which we don't really haven't really brushed upon today, but one of the key things there is that the Wormhole asset layer can sort of allow any token to be converted into one of these like X assets, as we call them. But their key feature is that they can traverse the entire Wormhole asset layer across all like 22 or 20 whatever blockchains there are, path independently. And so like this makes it extremely useful as a settlement platform. And so one of the things that people are really excited about is that a lot of dApps like will exist on like Ethereum or Polygon or something like and they'll kind of like grow as large as they can get on that ecosystem. And the limiting factor kind of becomes like, hey, like how do we tap into user bases? How do we reduce friction associated with getting into getting into our ecosystem or onto our platform? So one of the sort of most exciting use cases that we've seen is people round tripping tokens to do effectively single contract integrations. So you would just integrate with the Wormhole contracts of, if you're on like Polygon, let's say, you just integrate with the Wormhole contracts on Polygon or on Solana or wherever. And because this X asset layer shims like 7 different token standards and is path independent, you can effectively enable your experience to appear native like to a user on any blockchain that's in the Wormhole ecosystem. So users can come to Polygon with like a Solana wallet or something, and with very little on-chain code. It's all basically powered via the sophisticated nature of like the untrusted relayers. So the relayers can do things and shim a lot of sort of incompatibilities in a trustless manner, and that makes it quite powerful. So most things in DeFi effectively boil down to like tokens in, tokens out at this point. But if you're like a swap or a borrow lend or something based on Polygon, it can be extremely valuable to you to be able to accept tokens from any blockchain without the user necessarily having to set up a wallet natively to interact and like bridge some tokens over there, set it up. You can just like have them say like, hey, you can effectively say go to this website, connect whatever wallet you have, and just bridge some tokens into the contract, do whatever you're supposed to do, bridge the tokens back out. And the code for this in your smart contract looks very simple because everything is in Wormhole format, and so you just like don't even look at where they came from. You just take them in, do the processing, and then ship them back out to wherever they came from. So these are sort of like the first generation of cross-chain apps, and they're kind of that's like a very small amount of work, very small amount of like smart contract risk and auditing that you'd have to do. You don't have to go deploy 22 contracts or something like you would in most scenarios. And so that's kind of the beginning of the X step, and that's generally the path that I recommend people take, is kind of like, okay, get everywhere first, and then start looking to like, oh, okay, how can we better this experience? Maybe if we go over here and we use this AMM or something, then we can get better rates and we can offer something better to our users or something. And I think that's only going to become more powerful. We're going to see this go the way of distributed systems, where things will have specialties. You'll string together the things with different specialties to offer more powerful experiences. And I think that the industry is really already going that way, and we'll just see it continue to go deeper and deeper in that path over the course of the next several years.
Yeah, that is a very interesting mental model you just built out. Oftentimes, when I ask the question of a bridge, what are you seeing being built on top of a message passing layer? It's an answer like, oh, we're seeing like, a cross-chain lending platform, deposit on, Ethereum, and you take out a loan over on Polygon. But for you to describe that as actually what a messaging layer is going to do is transform how dApps are deployed, and actually like maybe how L1s are built, is really fascinating, and kind of leads me to my next question of like, where do you see Wormhole being in the next like 5 or 10 years? I think at some point crypto, I hate the term, but crypto is probably going to go mainstream. Is Wormhole just going to be completely in the as this deep piece of infrastructure, or do you guys feel like you're on the front lines?
It's a little of both. It will increasingly, for some reasons and a little bit of a history of the space, there's kind of this perception that like bridges are almost like vendor service providers that just like glue together layer ones and like aren't deserving of being their own like primitives or sort of like layer one or like I don't know, when you say layer one, people say blockchain, but like as we kind of said, there's a lot of primitives now that are like layer one type of things, but aren't blockchains. We really need a good term for those things. So Wormhole really already has a couple of those going for it. It has the Guardian network. It's also running its own Cosmos blockchain in Wormchain. And then in short order, Wormhole is going to be launching its generic relayer network. So that's currently in development. You can go look at it on GitHub. And that's really meant to be like a bit of a layer one, a decentralized network of relayers that are properly incentivized and things like that. And so, perhaps the long vision for these like generic for this like relayer network is kind of to become like the AWS Lambda of Web3 or decentralized computing, where you can go over to the database there, shove something in, grab something from the queue, go offload a thing into like that proof verification chain, go talk to an app specific chain, tie that all together, and just like, or also just like fully automate the thing, like just put in triggers. One of the items that's on the Wormhole roadmap as like proposed feature is adding some new programming paradigms to the decentralized space. One of the things that's always like disappointed me a little bit is like how few like just totally fully automated things there are in the DeFi ecosystem, where it's just like, well, I don't know, if the pith price drops below this, we should automatically like trigger a liquidation, and that liquidation should go over here to our the thing, and it should all just happen automatically, and then it should just like drop some money into a DAO. And like I haven't really seen too many of those sort of scenarios, but like those are very buildable, and I'm really excited for like people to start building those. So like what's the long-term vision of Wormhole? There's certainly like a very important piece to be played by like this zero knowledge proof attestations, but there's still very real infrastructure to be run, and there's probably always some realm of governance that's going to need to be applied, even if it's just like dealing with hard forks. Like if you are talking to a blockchain named Spartacus every day, and then one day you show up and suddenly everyone's claiming to be I'm Spartacus, you have to pick one. So some of these problems are kind of fundamental to the space, and so I think that like Wormhole will increasingly kind of become like a we don't have the jargon for it, but there will be like kind of multiple of these synergistic base layer runs on real hardware sort of components that comprise the Wormhole network. There's probably always going to be this like relayer component that shifts more and more towards being a little bit of like a automated process AWS Lambda sort of thing. There's probably always some form of governance that deals with issues surrounding like, okay, should we support this thing? Should we do this hard fork? How do we resolve this sort of situation? What do we do next? There's probably always some like governance level things surrounding that. And in the very long term, not sure.
Are you talking like token governance there, or like a different type of governance primitive? Because that's interesting to me, because I don't hear Wormhole talk about governance that often.
Yeah, I mean, Wormhole governance very much exists. It's done with the same kind of 13, and like when one of the contributions I made to Wormchain was actually rolling the proof of authority governance mechanism and staking system into Wormchain. So there is governance, and governance exists to solve those problems, which kind of fundamentally can only be solved by governance. So I think that will sort of always have to be. I don't see, I don't necessarily see a drop-in solution at this time. So I think there are things like that exist on Wormhole today that are going to be here for forever. And so I see the role only like sort of expanding and be more of a entrenched, important base layer thing to the ecosystem.
Beautiful. So we're kind of rolling up at the top of the hour here. Would love to just give you some runway to talk about what Wormhole is most excited about building in this bear market. I always love to hear what the nerds are doing when the prices might be going down, and then we'll just kind of wrap up and go on our merry way.
Sure. One of the things I think about the most, and that I'm, currently thinking most about is generic relayers. So rolling out this kind of real decentralized relayer solution that's going to be a decentralized network of them rather than like some just company that's, or just like a trusted entity or something like that. So kind of coming up with a real relaying solution that, fits most boats. I'm not sure it's ever going to support I'm trying to get it there in 400 milliseconds of pith, but it will be extremely useful for kind of the common use cases of Wormhole, bettering the user experience and just sort of making it easier and easier and requiring less code and putting more of the sort of convenience functions that make it super easy to take your thing on Solana and also make sure it works really smoothly with Ethereum. There's so many things kind of like being worked on across the board. There's like a new Explorer repo that's out there. I think there's a wallet aggregator being worked on that just kind of abstracts away some of the differences between like the Solana signing scheme versus the Ethereum signing scheme, and does a little bit of shimming across these various ecosystems. Aside from that, there's all sorts of things on the roadmap. Zero knowledge, obviously, also a hugely important thing. One of the things is that if you do want to, if the Guardian network is to expand beyond, like, say, the current number to like 100 or some number like that, it becomes really valuable to have a good like signing and compression scheme. So just rolling up the signing scheme into a verifiable zero knowledge proof might be a very effective way of doing it. So I think there's a lot of dividends you can get from zero knowledge proofs and sort of like good verifier systems that are in the interim before we probably necessarily have like pure zero knowledge state proofs of like the entire blockchain state or something. There's probably a couple of intermediate steps that still offer enough value to be worth doing. So those are kind of the things that are front of mind, at least for me.
Yeah, beautiful. If anyone's looking for like a job at Wormhole, I feel like you dropped a bunch of delightful alpha that can be used in any resumes and stuff like that. That's some good stuff. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to the Wormhole team for helping us write this A and B comparison article. Very, very appreciative of you taking an hour out of your day, Chase, to come and talk about Wormhole, kind of explain it. I think this is very important for the bridging space to actually come out and talk about the things we're building, because I think a lot of people are very, very scared of bridges in general. And the more we talk about it, the more we educate people, the less scary it becomes and the more exciting it should be. Because I think, I'm biased. I work at LI.Fi. We're bridge. But I do think bridges are the biggest piece of infrastructure that will come out of this kind of cycle, and kind of lay the path towards real true interoperability in the blockchain space. So I'm super excited. Chase, thanks for hopping on. And if you guys want to learn more about Wormhole, where should they go?
Sure. Best place is probably get started with wormhole.com. There's links to pretty much everything in the ecosystem from there. You can check out the GitHub if you want to dive into the code a little bit. There's also a Discord community, the Wormhole Discord. There's links to that on wormhole.com as well. Those are probably the best entry points.
Perfect. And from LI.FI's side, we have it's actually 12,000 words now, comparison article contrasting the different A and Bs. Wormhole is duly highlighted there, along with dBridge, Synapse, and a couple other bridges. So definitely go check that out. It's on our Medium page. It's pinned. We spent a lot of time on it. Shout out to Arjun, our head of research, who spearheaded that. And with that, I think we're going to end this Spaces. Thanks for hopping into the second iteration of this, since we got rugged by